Welcome to the series Wisecracks by Dr. Gerald Mann. Dr. Mann is the senior pastor at the Riverbend Church in Austin, Texas. Let's join Dr. Mann for more of Wisecracks.
The series on Proverbs, I've enjoyed doing this as much as anything I've ever done. It's called Wisecracks, Little Windows of Wisdom into Living Well. And today's segment is entitled Prayers God Cannot Answer. Prayers God cannot answer, from Proverbs 15, verse 8. God is unable to answer false prayers, but He delightfully responds to those who level with Him. Prayers that God cannot answer. I've been reading polls lately that say that 93% of the American people, everybody in this country over the age of 15, prays at least once a day. 93% pray every day. And yet, in over 8 years of taking calls from all over America from people about their religious faith, one of the most frequent questions that I get is, why does God not answer my prayers? I pray, I get no answers. Nothing happens. We all pray, but we get no answers. And you know, to be honest, I think over the years I've been a bit dishonest in my answer. Because one of the answers is that God cannot answer some of our prayers because they aren't really prayers. God cannot answer something that's not a prayer. That was Solomon's point in 15:8 that I read a moment ago. God is unable, he says, to answer false prayers, but He delightfully responds to people who level with Him. What are false prayers? Jesus talked about the same thing in Matthew 6 and Luke 11 and Luke 18. If you go and read honestly what Jesus said about prayer, most of what we do, or quite often what we do, is not prayer at all. No wonder we get no answers if we're not really praying. So I want to talk about some prayers that God cannot answer because they aren't prayers. And I made up these words myself, okay? They're not in the Bible. But the meaning is in the Bible. God cannot answer what I call thespian prayers. Now, thespian is not a religious denomination or a sexual preference, okay? A thespian, I read in the dictionary, is somebody who overacts a part to the point of being funny. Overacting a part, pretending and obviously pretending. Many of our prayers are pretentious. God cannot answer prayers that are pretentious, that are acted out. Jesus talked about two men in a parable who went up to the temple to pray, and He chose the two extremes. One, He said, was a Pharisee. Now, a Pharisee in those days when He was speaking is not what we think of as a Pharisee today. A Pharisee was the most respected person in society. He learned the Scriptures from the time he was a child. He prayed every day. He tithed. He kept the law. He was the most, he would have been the equivalent of a Mother Teresa. He would have been highly regarded. So he said, a Pharisee went up to pray, and then he said a tax collector. Now, a tax collector was not what a tax collector is today. A tax collector was a Jew who was collaborating with the Romans to extort money from his own people. He was the most hated. He was a collaborator. He had turned coat against his own people. So Jesus picked two people at the opposite ends of the extreme. A Pharisee, a tax collector, went up to the temple to pray. And he said, the Pharisee began by saying, "Oh God, how glad I am that I am not as other people. I tithe, I keep the law, I keep my word, I don't commit adultery, I do everything I'm supposed to do. I am so glad that I'm not like that thing over there." And he said that the publican, the tax collector, in the literal translation in the Greek, the tax collector dropped his head and beat on his chest, and all he could say is, "Mercy, mercy, mercy." That was all he could get out of his mouth. Mercy. And Jesus said when the two men came down from the hill, only one was right with God. Why? And who was he? The tax collector, because he was not playing a role. He was not pretending. He was leveling with God. He was pouring his heart out. He knew what he was. And yet, Even though I've read that many times, I tend to pretend in my prayers. I've written a little book called Wisecracks off of this series, and it's going to be a little bitty book, and on one it'll be the scripture and a little verse that I've written, plus the commentary. And on this particular one, I began by saying, when I listen to how I pray, it sounded not like me, but like some British poet from 1683. There were many these and thous, and even one, to wit. Where did I get the notion that the Almighty is a Brit? Sounded not like me. We all pretend, even though we try not to. I remember when I had just become a Christian in my last year in college, and I'd right off the football fields and brawling into bar rooms, and I'd gone to the seminary at Fort Worth, and I wanted to be a good scout for Jesus, and I started watching who the good scouts for Jesus were, and they announced they were going to have an evangelistic blitz where all of the seminary students, the preacher boys, were going to go out and win to Christ all of Fort Worth. We're going to go save Fort Worth. We were going into the bars and the back alleys and everywhere. We're going to, with our little literature, and we're going to accost people on the street and tell them about Jesus. And I got all caught up in this. And the night before we were going to kick off the blitz, they had a prayer meeting in the men's dorm. There was a circle of us, and they started praying one at a time around the circle. I knew eventually it would get to me. By the time it got to me, people were lying on the floor. They were wailing. They were crying. They were praying for 30 minutes without stopping. And I thought, man, when it gets to me, I got to do some kind of prayer. And so I fell right in line with all of the crying, and I was like Jimmy Swaggart with his lip shaking. And there was a guy who came right after me who later decided not to pursue the ministry, but went to the Naval Academy and he's now an admiral in the Navy. When it got to him, he said, Lord, it was a long pause first, long silence. Finally, he said, well, Lord, if we're all you've got, God help Fort Worth. Of course, he was anathema from then on. He was an outcast, but as I look back on that, he was probably the only honest prayer in the bunch. We were all thespians. God can't answer prayers that aren't from the real you. Another kind of prayer that God cannot answer is what I call magical prayer. Prayer which is designed to use technique and words to convince God to do what he otherwise wouldn't do for us. It's based on the premise that God must be somewhat senile. He must come in and out of lucidity. And if you catch him at the right moment and you got the right formula and the right words, you can get him to do what he wouldn't otherwise do. People call me all the time and say, I prayed and prayed about my problem. Would you pray for me? And I always say yes. But sometimes I probably ought to say no. My prayer is not any more powerful than your prayer. The Pope's prayer is not more powerful, or Billy Graham's, or anybody else's. The good news of God in Jesus Christ is that an open and honest heart, that prayer is just as powerful as anybody's prayer. You don't need to go get a professional prayer who has some sort of magical talent to convince God to do something he wouldn't otherwise do. Magical prayers are prayers that God cannot answer. Jesus said in Matthew 6, don't pray like the pagans. How do they pray? Repetitiously, endlessly, same words over and over. Sometimes they get all whipped up and start babbling, and they go through all these incantations and motions as though God were some sort of spirit who had to be conjured up out of the ether somewhere. He said, don't pray that way. Just say, and then he gave the Lord's Prayer, and you can summarize that by saying, Father, your will be done. Give me the 3 F's, forgiveness, fortitude, and food, because you're the only one in charge. Amen. Don't do that, he said. I heard one of the most bizarre stories from a funeral director that I've ever heard. We'd been to do a particular service, and I didn't know the deceased, and they had done some very bizarre things at the funeral, and we were driving back to the funeral home, and I said to him, I bet you've seen some unusual things in your years as a funeral director. I said, tell me the most unusual thing you've ever seen. He said, well, there was a baby died, about 6 months old. And we had the service at the church, and we went out to the cemetery, and the pastor was standing around with the family and a few friends, about a dozen of them. And instead of doing the interment service, the pastor said to them, "Do you know that if we really believed in God, we could pray and He could raise this child from the dead?" And he said, "Pastor, for 2 hours, they removed the body from the casket and they passed the body of that infant around, and each prayed, and they prayed, and they prayed. And it was getting on toward 5 o'clock. I didn't know what to do. It was the most desperate thing I have ever seen. I went over to the old grave digger who had been digging graves for years there, and I told him my dilemma, and he said, "I can solve that." Said he went over and got the pastor aside and whispered in his ear, and the pastor immediately put the child back in the casket, and everybody left. And when they left, I said, "What did you say to that pastor?" He said, "Well, I just told him that it was getting on toward 5 o'clock and that after 5 o'clock it cost $100 a minute to stay here." He said, "Well, didn't you feel badly about that?" He said, "Yeah, but I didn't feel near as bad as I did that this preacher was depriving these people of the presence of God at a time when they needed Him most in their lives." Now, that man probably had no formal education, but he had a lot of biblical wisdom. Prayer is not designed to use magic to change reality to fit what we want. Prayer is designed to change us to fit the reality we're in. And if you think God's going to change the world to fit you, good luck. Prayer is connecting to a power that allows us to deal with the hand we've been dealt. That's what prayer is. It is not magic. It is a giving myself to the situation I'm in and inviting a power I don't have to face it. God does not change reality to fit me. He can only change me to fit reality. Prayer is designed to change him who prays, said Augustine. So God cannot answer magical prayers. And finally, and I searched for this word for a long time. I've been searching for it for years, and it's the best word I can come up with. Don't go to sleep, because it's not a word used very often. God cannot answer xenophobic prayers. Xenophobia is a fear and hatred of foreigners, of strangers. And there are two kinds of xenophobic prayers. One is where we try to enlist God on our side against somebody else. We do that at football games. I used to pray before the football, "God, let us just beat the tar out of those guys. We're the righteous ones, Lord." I used to do real estate deals, and I would say, "Lord, that other broker that's my competitor, he doesn't worship you, but I'm a Christian. Let me win." God can't answer it. How about war? You know, the grunts who fight the war don't ever start it. People who shed their blood for it are not the ones that cause it. And you've got people on both sides of the line getting ready to do battle, and both of them are praying to the same God to let them kill the other one. God must simply weep. God cannot answer a prayer where you try to enlist His favor against somebody else. There's a second kind of xenophobic prayer, and this one really hits close to the heart. It's the kind of prayer where we ask God to give us something that we're unwilling to give somebody else. Example, Jesus said in His teaching on prayer in the Sermon on the Mount, do not ask God for forgiveness unless you're willing to give it. How many times have I gone to God and say, "Forgive me of this, that, and that," when I held something in resentment against another person? You cannot expect God to give you forgiveness unless you're willing to forgive. There's a reciprocity built into the reality of prayer. If I don't forgive, I can't get forgiveness, and that's what Jesus said. How many times have we asked God to be generous to us when we ourselves refuse to be generous? The point is that you cannot ask God to give you something you're not willing to give yourself. That's xenophobic praying. That's making God your own little pet. I remember the story. It's an old story about the little girl and the little boy who had a sibling rivalry going. And did you ever have one of those in your family? We had them in ours. And the little girl and the little boy were just at loggerheads all the time, trying to manipulate the daddy. And the girl was, especially little girls can manipulate their daddies. So the daddy came in one day and she said, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," and ran and jumped into his arms and threw her arms around him and gave him a big kiss and looked over his shoulder. And in his ear, she said, "Oh, Daddy, I love you so much." And to her little brother, she said, unbeknownst to her, the dad saw it in the mirror. And he set her down and said, "Sis, you can't love Daddy unless you love Bubba." How many people have gone to prayer in this world in the last 24 hours who hate somebody and ask God to love them? "Oh, God, I love you so much, but I can't stand the fundamentalists. Or I can't stand the liberals, or I can't stand this or that. I hate them, but I love you, God." Yeah, xenophobic praying. God can't answer prayers like that. What does it mean truly to level with God? The best personal help I ever received on prayer was from a little booklet by the Catholic mystic. He died a few months ago, Henry Nouwen. He has a little book called With Open Hands. It taught me more about prayer than anything I ever learned. It's only 5 minutes to read it. He said that for years he went to God with clenched fists. And he held on to all of his fears and all of his problems. And he said, "God, I'm holding on to these, and I'm coming to you with this problem and this problem and this problem. And God, you've got to do something about it because nobody else can." And he said one day he realized that God could never fill his hands as long as they were clenched. And he said he learned that prayer was opening his palms to God and letting go of all of that stuff he was holding on to so that God could fill those hands with what he needed. See, we go clenching what we want. God gives us what we need. God never promised you to give you everything you want. He promised to give you everything you need. My friend Bob Buford lost his son, who was a bright young man with a bright future, drowned swimming in the Rio Grande River. And it was a great tragedy of his life. Bob Buford was a very successful businessman. He's written a wonderful book. I recommend it to all men throughout this country and in our congregation. It's called Halftime. And this happened in Bob's midlife, and it was a great tragedy of his life. And he went to the Rio Grande River where his son had drowned. And he said the moment that gave him the breakthrough, the beginning of his healing, was where he practiced Nouwen's method, but instead of opening his hands this way, he clenched his fist, symbolically holding his son over the river and let go. And then he turned his palms upward to receive what God would give him. It was a turning point in his life. That's what prayer is. That's what it means to level with God. Everybody in this room is holding on to something. And I think that at the end of our sermon, which is now, I think it would be good if we would take the few moments we usually take to give those of you who would like to join. If you'd like to do that, go ahead and fill out the information. But I would like for us to be very quiet in this moment of reflection. And I invite you symbolically to close your eyes and to hold out all those things that you're holding on to. Hold your hands out and let them go. And turn the palms of your life up to God and receive what it is He wants you to have. That's what true prayer is.
Thank you for joining us for the series Wisecracks. For information on other audio tapes or books by Dr. Gerald Mann, please call 1-800-388-9500 or write to Gerald Mann Ministries, P.O. Box 842076, Dallas, Texas 75284. You can turn the tape over now for the continuation of this series from Dr. Gerald Mann.